We've got a panel now on biodiversity and the, quote, working landscape, unquote. Put that in parentheses because of the discussion of whether the appropriateness of that. Four speakers, and I'll introduce them each in turn as they come up. First speaker is Jeff Eisenberg. Jeff is the Director of Federal Lands for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and he also does some work on the Farm Bill programs for that group. Previously, he spent a number of years with the Nature Conservancy, working on private land conservation, and he had a direct role in drafting the Grassland Reserve Program, which is part of the last Farm Bill. And before TNC, Jeff worked as an attorney for the USDA on forest issues. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the conference organizers for thinking of inviting the cattlemen to be here. I feel that this conference has been just a real pleasure, very interesting, and it's going to give us a lot of good thoughts as we go forward in trying to do our own work on the Endangered Species Act. So I certainly want to extend my thanks for that. I'd like to say that when I read the title of our panel, I wasn't immediately seized with an idea of what I wanted to tell everybody or what our point of view would even be. Instead, I was just seized with questions about what it meant and really where we fit in, both with the conservation community and just with respect to our own activities. And while many of the presentations at the conference have been very stimulating and enjoyable, if anything, they've only given me more questions. When I read the title, Maintaining Biodiversity and Working Landscapes, I asked the basic question, can biodiversity even be maintained on working landscapes? Doesn't the concept of working landscapes inherently imply that the choice has been made in favor of working and away from biodiversity? Would society tolerate reversing the course of history in favor of biodiversity and at the expense of working landscapes? Does the subject matter really represent someone's overly optimistic view about how the lion will sleep with the lamb and the environmentalist with the rancher? Or does the subject matter represent the direction in which this policy in this country is moving apart from the doubting questions of a representative of the cattle industry? It's easier to ask the questions than to provide satisfactory answers to the difficult quandary of proposing a direction for management of our nation's working lands. With all due respect to Mark. And I'm tempted at this point to stop at this point, since in fact I don't have any of the answers, but I recognize more is expected of me, so I'll push on with a few observations. First, the first thing I'd like to say is that, as I have already said, is that a lot of good ideas have been expressed here generally about the operation of the Endangered Species Act. One thing, though, that I've been really struck by is sort of the lack of synthesis of these ideas with what may actually happen in terms of both policy formulation and then implementation of that policy. And let alone for how these different ideas might then translate to meeting recovery goals. One sort of clear example that jumped out from just the last presentation, someone made a comment about they feel that this area has to move forward by incrementalism. Well, I agree. You know, I think this is difficult. It's going to require a sea change, and that's what's going to happen. But then, you know, if you say that and if you proceed with policy on the basis of incrementalism, what does that mean for meeting your recovery goals? What does that mean really for the act and for conservation of biodiversity generally? You know, from where I sit, all policy, including ESA policy, results from human experience in their social and natural environments, and then how that experience translates to politics. And really, maybe this is a bit jaded and I'm giving away too much of my bias of where the world in which I operate, but I think all of these environmental policies and conservation policies end up being political decisions. A very strong example of that is my work in the Farm Bill last time with the Nature Conservancy. A very important program to us was the reauthorization of the Wetland Reserve Program. We set out to try to determine a factual basis for a dollar figure at which we could seek reauthorization. And you know, the information is shaky, but there's some information out there that at least would allow us to go forward. But at the end of the day, what really happened for determining the number for the reauthorization of the program was how much money was left over after the commodity programs, and then how that remaining pie was going to be split up among the different conservation programs. And so I always believe that the first step that we should have as we sally forth into policy is facts, because they do inform questions and they influence things. But at the end, I just cannot overstate, in my view, the importance of politics and policy and really, shaping the direction of how these things go. And I urge really all the participants here to give greater thought to how the many good ideas here would really translate to action, both in Congress at the federal level and then of all things on the ground as well. Talk a little bit about some of the politics or the basis for how the cattlemen view the world. Understanding the effort to maintain biodiversity on working landscapes begins with the recognition that the vast majority of acres that farmers and ranchers, and I'll stop saying farmers, ranchers work, have seen a considerable imprint, or as we like to say in the cattlemen, the hoofprint of human activity, putting aside all the acres that have been urbanized. So the significance of this, from our view, is that no one will ever be able to restore biodiversity to the conditions in place pre-settlement. That phase of natural history has come and gone. If you accept that, the next step is really to realize that whatever level of biodiversity we seek as a society will ultimately, informed by science, but ultimately represent a political compromise somewhere between the unattainable pre-settlement levels and then, God forbid, the extirpation of all species. And I feel like drawing the line between those two extremes is particularly obvious in the working landscape, where the land has really all been cultivated and turned over to some extent. The single most important cause for the decrease in biodiversity is the conversion of land for urbanization or cropland or other purposes. Increases in population and tastes in land use will ensure that continued conversion will continue. One can think about a hierarchy of land uses that are decreasingly friendly to biodiversity, starting with wildlands, wilderness, rangeland, cropland, and then finally development. Innumerable factors affect whether land use progresses on this continuum. Population growth and economic dynamics undoubtedly go the longest way to explain patterns of land use. But natural features such as soil types, precipitation, temperature are important, and obviously government policies are also critical. Society needs to come together to think more broadly about preferred land uses for biodiversity in the context of all pressures affecting land use. Much of the debate today centers around the damage being done by this or that land use. But no one at this conference, though, would really argue about whether use of land by ranchers needs to be sustainable as a matter of national policy. We would all agree on that. Still, a more constructive discourse on leaving habitat for biodiversity would turn on how a particular use fits into a broader context of all factors leading to the disappearance of habitat for biodiversity. The ESA brings needed and useful attention to wildlife conservation, but doesn't really do anything, or maybe that's too much, but doesn't do much for addressing the broader underlying causes of the disappearance of habitat for biodiversity. Considering the broader context in which land use choices occur is more than just a practical imperative. It's also the humane imperative. Agricultural lands generally, and the West, was settled in some part because of deliberate government policy to encourage the settlement and development of natural resources, as well as general desire by people to do better than they were able to do in their existing situation. These people have given the West its character, its culture, built its communities. They know the land and are on it every single day and love it in a way that few of us can really directly understand. In our view, it's inhumane to force or expect individuals who are on the land to give up their way of life. And you say, well, maybe isn't that a little dramatic? Aren't you exaggerating? And I'll tell you that in my own concrete experience in the year I've been with the Cattlemen, there's a lot of people and a lot of pressure who approach the question from that point of view. And I think it is an undercurrent that shapes the expectations and the sort of the culture around the debate about land use in the country. All of which brings us to the subject of this panel, saving biodiversity on working lands. Efforts to accommodate biodiversity on working lands include things that have been mentioned, really: identifying zones of biota worth conserving, farm bill programs, smart growth proposals by state or county governments, bond issues has come up. The introduction of each of these measures shows society's interest in thinking more closely about making the accommodation between conservation and working lands. The challenge, though, really is to show measurable improvement in the condition of biodiversity as a result of the measures. At this time, it's very difficult to show correlation between the implementation of best management practices and improvement in the condition for biodiversity. Ultimately, the public will ask, or at least have the right to know, whether the money they are spending are bringing back any kind of demonstrable results. Most efforts to date to show improvement have relied on proxies, such as program implementation, rather than actual benefits to wildlife. I have particular experience with the NRCS Farm Bill programs, and it's frustrating to no end. You know, if you're asking them, well, how are you doing? And they'll just tell you how many contracts they've signed. And I realize that this comes up, in fact, just the other day with respect to the Klamath Basin. They feel like they're the only agency that's got jurisdiction over the entire basin, and they're looking at the whole thing, and this is great. What are you doing? Well, we've signed these contracts. Well, how is that going to make a difference for water quality, water temperature, sedimentation? And they really aren't able or prepared to answer those questions. And, you know, and I urge them forward for, you know, from our point of view, having effective measures is important for reaching a comprehensive settlement in that basin. But that's one example, really, of how the current measures for saving biodiversity with the current programs just are inadequate. To really be successful, further research is needed in this area. Research is needed to determine what constitutes viable biodiversity in the context of current and likely future social use of working landscapes. Further research is needed to determine what measures must be taken to conserve that diversity. Working at the Nature Conservancy, it was a huge struggle that we constantly struggled with, a huge struggle that we constantly confronted, which is on these working landscapes, what is it that we were going to do that was actually going to make a difference besides just signing up more and more people for CRP or getting wetlands preserved? How is that really affecting the welfare of the species? And the Conservancy, you know, to their credit, was constantly trying to measure the value of their work, but still, in the years that I was there, the conclusion was they didn't have the answer. So, what I take from all this is that ESA is a good thing. Conservation of species, endangered species, is an important social goal that's reflected in the passage of the ESA, and it's one that many of us are committed to seeing succeed. But by the same token, we need to, as we go forward in the face of all this uncertainty, we've got to realize that land use restrictions are not just someone's idea of a good or bad policy. They eat at the capital needed to maintain the way of life for the people who've been there both now and for generations. Sometimes these restrictions are necessary anyway, but really eroding the ability for people to stay on the land, it emphasizes the point that policymakers must tread humbly, with modesty, before they decide that they need to impact people's livelihood. And really, greater respect needs to be shown to the men and women who work the land. Biodiversity solutions must accommodate the need for farmers and ranchers to make a living, as well as accommodate the conservation of biodiversity. And really, this point, it's more than just respect for the farmers. I believe that politically, for the conservation movement to really broaden and succeed, it's going to have greater political acceptability by showing how this all can work together. The ESA by itself and in combination with other policies and actions will also have to address a broader range of threats to succeed in its ultimate mission. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeff. That's great. And thanks for being exactly on time to the second. It's most impressive. Thank you. So the second panelist is Hilary Swain. Hilary is the director of Archbold Biological Station. That's an ecological research institute that owns and manages 8,800 acres of globally imperiled scrub preserve, which has 19 federally listed species on it. They also own and manage a 3,000-head, 10,000-acre cattle ranch with 5 federal listed species on it. And overall, they conduct research on the relationships between physical, ecological, and economic factors in working landscapes. Exactly on the target of this panel. Hilary. So if I look at this, that's this one. Yeah.
Just open that first slide.
Open this one.
Just go to the other.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. I appreciate the invitation, and I realize I'm here, as usual, as what's called the reality check. So I'm going to try and answer some questions that we were asked to address by Buzz Thompson, and I'm going to provide a series of reality checks as we go through. I'm going to say that my bias is unashamedly from Florida. Hang on, just get myself going here. And you know, we've had various reflections that in many ways every state has a different ESA. So although Florida's a peculiar circumstances, it's no more peculiar than any of the circumstances in any other state because of land use and different policies and state regulations. I wanted to start, first of all, by asking the question, answering the question, has the ESA helped identify those parts of the landscape we want to protect, either for federally listed species or for biodiversity in general? And these are same places. And I'll reiterate what many other speakers have said, that in Florida, if you look at the NatureServe data, Florida Natural Areas Inventory, or FNA, of the 462 species that they track, only about a quarter, 111, are federally listed. So we recognize straight away that we are looking at an underrepresentation of the biodiversity that we should really be concerned about if we're worried about vulnerable species in Florida. Not only that, and there is another peculiar emphasis which I haven't heard anyone else say, is not only are only a small proportion of those species that are vulnerable listed in Florida, but an even smaller proportion and a much more severely skewed subset of those receive any enforcement action. So that is another tremendous bias in which species we're working on in the landscape, is which species we're actually got any enforcement action on. So the second part of that question, you know, have we identified those species in the landscape, is where are they in the landscape? And I'd like to thank FNA for helping me with this analysis. Apparently I've got to bring this thing to life first. Yes, it's to life now. If we look at where federally listed species are in the landscape, and we have to recognize that we're not going to get a new species, a new reauthorization of the Endangered Species Act. We're not going to get more listed species. We've only got 14 candidate species in Florida, so we're basically working with those that are already on the Act. But of those that are already covered under the Act, I want to make 3 points from this diagram. First of all, the state of Florida has had an absolutely massive program in land acquisition. 26% of the state of Florida is protected in some form of protected lands. Only half of those are federal lands. So when I constantly see these analyses that most endangered species are not of federal lands, they never seem to include the fact that a lot of state lands are actually protecting many listed species. So we need to go back and redo that analysis. The state of Florida has 2 programs, Preservation 2000, which is now finished, and Florida Forever. And between previous acquisitions, this is the grey areas here, which you can see on the landscape, patched in grey, and recent acquisitions, which are stippled, and purple, which are the proposed acquisitions. We have currently under protection in Florida on existing reserves, about 64% of endangered species element occurrence acreages is on existing protected areas, 64%, and about 35% of threatened species. This is much better than some of the other numbers I've seen for other states. Another 7% of each of those are actually covered under proposed reserves. So newly proposed reserves will cover another 7% of those element occurrences. Now, we all recognize that element occurrences are biased against private lands, and we also recognize that they don't take into account connectivity, but just bear with me while we work through this. The flip side of this is, although many of the species that we're strongly concerned about in Florida are already on publicly managed lands, it is quite clear if you look at the red and the yellow areas, those are the element occurrence acreages for threatened and endangered species outside the reserve network, that a very large proportion of the lands that we should be concerned about are still on private lands. It doesn't take a brilliant spatial analyst to realize that there's a very strong correspondence with where many of these element occurrences are, and admittedly there are of course some up in the Panhandle and other areas, but many of those element occurrences overlap with exactly where the big, large cattle ranches are in Florida. This map shows it's a sort of representation of where the cows are in Florida. The darker you are, the more cows you have. So the first reality check I have looking at private lands is that I want to remind us, although there was something of an anti-reserve bias in some of the papers that I read in preparing for coming here, and at the risk of being labelled as a reserve Luddite by Mike Rosenzweig. And while acknowledging that the reserve approach cannot be the only conservation tool, I completely agree with you, Buzz Thompson, I cannot help but saying that we should not ignore the importance of reserves in the landscape. There's no point focusing on the working landscape if we don't have the reserves around which to anchor that focus. So, and for many of those species, particularly the ones that we've termed regularly here conservation dependent or not culture tolerant would be the alternative, they are going to rely on these reserve or protected areas. So the sort of take-home message from this is reserves are still important and we should not ignore it, but that threatened and endangered species occur very extensively in private lands, and many of these are large-scale working cattle ranches in Florida. Well, given that, or understanding that, how should we think about both our regulatory approaches under the ESA and also our collaborative or sort of cooperative approaches under the ESA in working with private landowners? And I'm particularly concerned about how we should target these. Where do we get the most bang for our public buck with working with private landowners? One way of looking at it is saying, sort of which species should we be working on? And I did a quick little analysis. These are the number of managed lands element occurrences. So these are records on managed lands. And these are the number of records on private lands. And each one of these dots represents a different terrestrial species in Florida. And of course, not surprisingly, we've actually spent a lot of time working on private lands with these large area requiring species. But a question I might ask you is maybe we should be really focusing, maybe we can get an enormous bang for our buck by working with the private landowners who support species that have very, very few occurrences on managed lands. Maybe that's where we can get a very large bang for our buck. I mean, we have some private landowners who have some of the last remaining populations of these listed species about which we're so concerned. So one targeted approach is, where do we get most species protection? Actually not waiting for private landowners to come to us to react to programs, but specifically going out and seeking certain private landowners that have disproportionate responsibility for some species and may be able to work with us to help with stewardship. The other way of looking at it is not to take a species-by-species approach. One of the things I would dearly love to see for Florida is if we could take all of our federally listed species and we had decent either recovery target areas or critical areas of concern for each of those species, and we could overlay them and we could say, this is where we get the greatest synergy, this is where we get the greatest bang for our dollar in terms of working with private landowners in the area where there's an intersection among all of those species. I've seen nothing, particularly not in any multi-species recovery plan, that has even begun to attempt to do something like that. We have an existing analysis in Florida that could actually be a start for this, and that for the state acquisition program, for the reserve acquisition program, we have gone through a huge reserve design exercise to identify what lands would be needed, not for acquisition, but in general, if we wanted to meet all of the state's land acquisition goals, not just for species, but for wetlands, for recharge, for the various other criteria that you have for state acquisition goals. And you're looking at a very early and unpublishable draft of a bit for Central Florida, where the grey are existing managed lands. This is Archbold here where I work. And the red are all of the areas that would be needed to meet all of the state's targets for sort of species protection and land acquisition. It is quite clear that this cannot be achieved by land acquisition. This would be a massive undertaking. On the other hand, it gives us a very strong indication of where we could focus private efforts in order to get the greatest gains for conservation. If we repeated these sorts of analysis with threatened and endangered species, we'd have a much tighter analysis. This has to meet very broad criteria. So, and the take-home message or the reality check is if we're going to focus on private lands, either for a regulatory or what I would argue, much more importantly, incentive basis, we should target where we get the most value for money. And that process needs to be objective and systematic and transparent so people can understand it. So the next question we were asked to address is, to what extent has the regulatory approach of the ESA contributed towards conserving biodiversity? And I'm going to run through some things from my personal observations I think have been positives, and then mention the things that I think are negatives. So the first positive about having the regulatory black cloud hanging over our heads in Florida is that it was one of the real factors that pushed state and local land acquisition. Of the $24 billion that Mark talked about yesterday that raised for local and state land acquisition, $7 billion of that has been raised in Florida. This is not a trivial undertaking. So that black cloud of regulation raised a bipartisan effort in the state of Florida that we know we can't buy our way completely out of this problem, but we can sure go a long way towards it. A second sort of positive is, I think it really increased the awareness of non-game species in Florida. Not only did it transform the federal agency, but it also transformed state and, to a large extent, public views of why land is important, and that is that is a significant impact. The third observation, and this is a personal observation, is, and it's an unquantified positive, and I would suggest to those of people who are really interested in policy, getting hold of this unquantified positive would be interesting, and that is that I think the regulatory environment has, in some cases, changed the footprint of where people do things. They've chosen places that did not have listed species because they were easier to get development through on. None of that is quantified. You don't know those sorts of barroom or backroom discussions about where to start a project. You only know when the permits start coming in. So we really have no idea of to what extent it shuffled around the footprint. I've noticed myself recently, we used to always get scrublands coming in for permitting. Now we're getting abandoned citrus groves. Why? Citrus has gone down in value. Citrus land has gone down in value 50% in the last 5 years. People have suddenly realized, oh, it's easier to do it in abandoned citrus groves than it is in native scrub. The fourth positive is that this has set aside some small-scale lands in protection. So the regulatory approach has actually created some reserves. And this would be the sort of conservation banking or mitigation banking approach. I've personally regarded this as not very successful, and I'll give you a couple of case studies to show why I feel it has not been particularly successful. The first one is from Brevard County in Florida. You may think that all conservation banks are official. This is a myth. Many conservation banks are completely unofficial and de facto. You get a call on the phone, hello, I've just talked to Fish and Wildlife Service and they say I've got to buy some land next to Archbold. I mean, that's how it goes. So there are all these sort of de facto conservation banks everywhere. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of a couple of de facto conservation banks. This is one, Brevard County, critical for Florida scrub habitat, major acquisition program in the state, 37,000 acres proposed for acquisition for protection of scrub, a listed species. Of those 37,000 acres, they've bought 36% to date. And I'm going to focus in on this little area here, which is this big area here. This is a 7,000 acre block at the south end of the county that connects with other existing protected areas. And within that, they've bought, again, 36% of this. The green is what's been bought. You'll notice how tough it is to buy land in Florida, often half acre at a time. Of that total acreage, the 37,000, the 7,000 here, 321 acres have been generated by donated lands from mitigation. In the meantime, we've lost 50% of the scrub jays in this population in the last 10 years. So the state acquisition and local acquisition program have had a big impact, but the mitigation funding has only produced maybe 1 to 2% of that acreage. Same thing on the Lake Wales Ridge. We've acquired something like 30,000 acres in the last 10 years under state acquisition programs. But the mitigation programs in that same period have generated 200 acres of mitigation, some around TNC land and some around Archbold. Why has that mitigation been so unsuccessful? Why have these conservation banks not worked? Well, this is my rapid list of why it doesn't work. 1, we're not enforcing most species, particularly plants. 2, it relies on a high degree of self-reporting, which is not always happening. 3, we're not enforcing small sites. We don't enforce anything under 10 acres. That's where the vast majority of the land is disappearing. 4, it's painfully slow, and it's a painful acquisition process. 5, we're not asking for sufficient mitigation. Many landowners have realized if they go through a 401, 404 permit application, they have less mitigation required than if they go for a Section 10. So they cottoned onto that. 6, we still allow mitigation on site, even though every document we've got suggests that on-site mitigation in small areas doesn't work. 7, we're not enforcing unoccupied habitat. So if scrub hasn't burnt for so long, there's no species left in it. And that's, why bother with a safe harbour if you can just wait a few years and species disappear anyway? 8, the permitting staff get tied up in the minutiae of the project and they forget the big picture of what they're trying to do. And 9, agricultural lands are rarely regulated. Private lands are kind of off this radar screen for the comments that Buzz Thompson has made. They usually don't have to pull permits for land clearing. And for many of them, they could never go through this mitigation process anyway, because the margins on agricultural lands would never support the mitigation. It would never support the payments that you would need to do that conversion. And, we work with development because they can afford to pay the price. The cost of doing business is you pay for it. You cannot do that in the working landscape because your margins are pathetic. On our working cattle ranch, we're lucky if we make 1% per year on a $15 million asset. That's how pathetic it is. Okay. Right. Those were the those were the kind of positives. A bit of, we've set aside some. What was that?
Those are positives.
The negatives is we've managed to create a ghastly atmosphere with private landowners that really, I can't imagine the amount of bad will all of this has generated. And what's extraordinary to me is after 30 years, we still don't know whether the net gain has been good, whether the positives have outweighed the negatives, because so many of those are unquantifiable backdoor rooms, things that we never understand. Can I just refit here, right, really quick? Okay, so I'm really into incentive programs and I'm really into doing private landowners, many cases, particularly these cattle owners, really want to do the right thing. They have an awful lot in common with the conservation community. They're working on very poor marginal lands, marginal returns, and they're often in a holding pattern. We're looking for ways of keeping these guys in business. What sort of options do we have available? Well, yes, there are all of these federal options. I, as a manager of a piece of private land, I have no less than 28 programs I can choose from. This is just unbelievable for a private landowner. I'm an extremely knowledgeable grant writer, and this is just exhausting going through this array of programs. These are the ones that are available from Fish and Wildlife Service. It's, each one is an effort. You bring them out here. It's a hard work. They all require matching cost share. You have to do something extra and beyond what you're already doing anyway. We need to think more about what we need to do to keep private landowners in business doing the things that are supporting the species we're worried about. And final slide is Of course, the really big money is not with things like the Fish and Wildlife Service. The really big money is with things like the Farm Bill money, things like the Wetland Reserve programs. These are some of the other federal, state and non-profit programs that we could apply for money for. It's bewildering, but landowners need hand-holding through this. The delivery system is out there, the extension system is out there, the staff are not trained to deliver conservation products, so there needs to be more training in that area. Things that we haven't even talked about. One of the big engineering firms, CH2M Hills, just started a new program to work with private landowners to actually integrate applications for all of these different programs to them. What about US Fish and Wildlife Service acting to hold conservation easements for those who are doing estate tax planning and are setting up conservation easements? Every time I've asked Fish and Wildlife Service whether they'll hold an easement over us, they always say, oh, we don't do that. So I'll end up by saying that there are tremendous opportunities for working with private landowners, but we have to target them in the right place. We have to tell landowners why we are involved, and we have to have methods of knowing how effective they are in the long term. Otherwise, we'll lose public trust in those programs. Sorry for being funny.
Yeah, well, thanks, Hilary. You did a great job of fitting a 30-minute presentation into 15 plus minutes. Appreciate that. So the next speaker is Jim Kraft. Jim is Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Plum Creek Timber Company. It's a position he's held for about 14 years now, if I read this right. Jim has an interesting background. He was educated at Harvard, where he studied East Asian Studies and learned to speak Japanese. Went to law school at Harvard, worked for Milbank Tweed, which is a big New York corporate law firm, where he handled Japanese deal-making. And then I guess he had a conversion and moved back to the West Coast, where he worked for Burlington Northern, and then helped on the transition where Plum Creek was sold off as an IPO in 1989. And since then he's been working with Plum Creek Timber and has a lot of hands-on experience with habitat conservation issues. Jim.
Mine's right here.
Let's get rid of this one.
Flip that one. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Unlike many here today, I come at it from a different angle. I'm not an academic. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a government agent. I look at this from the other side of the trench, out in the field, out in the forest, and over the last decade, we've had quite a bit of experience, so I am the case study for the working landscape, at least as it relates to forestry. Today, I'd like to talk, or leave you with two general thoughts. One, how can we change the ESA, the process, to make it easier, make it simpler and less costly, and I hope I can leave you with some concrete suggestions. And second, there's been a lot of talk kind of theoretically about incentives. Hopefully I can suggest a model, at least one model out there for how we can effectively offer economic incentives. Let's see if I can do this. First, an introduction. Who is, or what is Plum Creek Timber Company? We're now the second largest landowner in the United States. We own 8 million acres of working landscape. We're in 21 different states. As you can see, we own a lot of landscape that is providing habitat for a lot of megafauna, the spotted owl, salmon, grizzly bear, bull trout, butterflies, red cockaded woodpeckers, and so on. So there are a number of tools out there that we had to deal with those species. And we have, over the last decade, used all of these tools to try to address what's going on our landscape. And you might ask, why did we do this? What was our incentive for entering into these long-term conservation agreements on our land? And we had a number of goals that we wanted to see happen. And I would point to predictability. That was one of the key goals that we had. The other down here is operational practicability and flexibility. We then asked ourselves in each one of these cases a number of questions, and I'm just going to focus on one, which is what is the risk of take? Without Section 9, the stick out there, the vinegar, if you will, would we have done these plans? And I'd have to say probably not. There are a whole host of other questions that we asked. But we did, and over the last decade, we've done multi-species plans in the Central Cascades for owls and 285 other species. And to Buzz's point, this is a working landscape. It's a habitat plan that's interspersed among federal reserves, so it provides that interstitial protection of habitat that is so essential outside of those federal reserves. In 1995, we did a Section 7 agreement for grizzly bears in the Swan Valley, and since then we've amended it to provide for land sales, where when we sell land that's in that valley, the new landowner will have covenants that are grizzly bear friendly. So it's another way, once you get into these types of processes, you can have the small landowner still be part of a larger conservation objective. And a whole host of other plans. One of the things that was really important in these is what came out of it. And one of the things that I've heard in the conference so far is how do we deal with uncertainty and the lack of scientific information? How can we have the kind of learning from experience that Hillary just mentioned? And part of these plans all include adaptive management provisions that are very sophisticated, that as we learn from what we do, our plans then provide feedback loops to improve them as we go. What does our experience under the ESA teach us? What are the difficulties that we encountered, and what are other landowners encountering going forward? And I think one thing that we've heard before is that a purely regulatory approach won't work. Generally speaking, Section 9, as it's turning out, is not a very effective way to manage for species. Conservation agreements in that second bullet are very hard to negotiate. We're a large company, and it cost us millions of dollars to do these, and the small landowner probably doesn't have the ability. Another element that hasn't been talked about here is the changing land ownership pattern. When we look at our landscape of 8 million acres, we're not going to be the owner of that same 8 million acres a year from now or 2 years from now. There's going to be lands that are going to be sold, there's going to be lands that are bought. Yet what we're trying to do in some of these plans is to provide for long-term habitat. So a comment I would make is that we have to accommodate the marketplace for land when we come up with conservation on working landscapes. And we've done that through an approach in one of our HCPs where we have a land sales bank where we get credits for conservation-friendly land sales. And that gives us credits if we want to sell some other lands for development purposes. So it's just an idea of how to approach that issue. We've talked a lot about a lot of these other things, and I was going to, at this point, go through a case study, but there's not time, so I'm going to skip a number of slides and move ahead to what's needed. Given those obstacles that we had, what can we do? And one of the things that when we've negotiated plans, particularly large-scale plans, and I'll take the fish HCP that we did in Montana and Idaho as an example. We had 3 separate agencies and the state all interested and involved in this process. And we would reach an agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service biologist after much negotiation and talking, only to find that the NIMS biologist, for the same habitat, the same issue, would have a different approach. And God forbid, if the state biologist got in there, they would have a completely different idea as well. So it made the negotiation of a plan very difficult. So one concrete suggestion going forward, which probably requires major bureaucratic change, is to have one voice negotiating plans with landowners. And a comment about having states be in charge of these things, my take on that is that if you're talking about command and control top-down regulation, one regulator is as bad as the other. And in fact, I would say my experience has been that the scientists in the federal agencies, although this isn't 100% true, but generally speaking, had a bigger picture and were easier to deal with than their counterparts in the state agencies. A second concrete suggestion has to do with how some of the other disclosure statutes work. We heard that under Section 7, the agencies have to consult with themselves. And what do you think of that? Well, I think it's a good plan. They have to consult with themselves over an HCP. And that's on top of the section, the HCP analysis that you have to do, on top of the NEPA analysis that you have to do. And I would suggest as a statutory or regulatory reform that be streamlined into just one set of analysis and eliminate the triplicate that you have to go through today, because that is expensive and it's an easy hook for what I would call frivolous litigation. There's a second part of that, which is the National Historic Preservation Act, which you would think, why does that apply to a private HCP? Well, the issuance of a permit is deemed to be a federal action which triggers NEPA compliance. Well, when we were doing our fish HCP, it covers 1.5 million acres. We have 17 treaty tribes, 3 state historic preservation officers if we went into Washington State. And the Native Americans didn't know where all their cultural resources were. They didn't want to talk to us about them in any event. And so the end result was that we basically excluded any land out of our HCP, which otherwise would have been good fish habitat conservation, from the HCP, because we just couldn't deal with that statute. And I think a regulatory change could ease that burden. Finally, I think there's something which we could all agree upon, which is we need more funding for the services to both complete plans, to negotiate plans by having good information, because oftentimes what I've found is that federal biologists don't know enough. They don't have enough data about the species that they've listed to even begin to come up with workable plans. And then money to modify, to monitor, to work with us in the adaptive management process. And part of that, I think, is prioritization where the money goes. I think the agency should put their budgets and focus them on on-the-ground solutions, as opposed to, and I'll get on the critical habitat bandwagon, which doesn't really, in my mind, add that much value to on-the-ground conservation. Financial incentives. Assuming that we get some of these things fixed with the ESA and HCPs begin to work better for listed species, what can we do before they even get listed? And my number one axiom, if it isn't economic, it's not sustainable. It won't work. And you heard Hillary just say, the margins on the working landscape are really thin. We're not going to have conservation out there if it isn't economic. There are a number of things that are happening right now. One is there's a proposal to authorize conservation bonds that are tax exempt. It's passed both houses, and it's before a conference committee now, and the question is it going to be a pilot project in Washington State, or is it going to be maybe broader in 5 or 6 states? Get out there and urge the passage of a broad pilot project. This bill allows the acquisition of land, and the buyer then continues to manage it, but with a conservation orientation. It continues to be a working landscape, however. So this is, I think, another tool that's out there. I'd also make a point that I'm not here from the timber industry saying that we shouldn't have a baseline of regulation, and I'm not going to get into the argument with Professor Rogers as to where the appropriate line is between private property rights and what's appropriate regulation. It is where it's going to end up being through the political process, it seems to me. But above that level of regulation, when we want more conservation, then I think we have to have economic incentives. And so what I'd like to do is just briefly touch upon what I think is a workable model. And it's working out there right now in the context of recovering Pacific coastal salmon. Over the last 3 years, Congress has funded what I call the surfboards to the tune of about $350 million. I had no idea until I started researching this talk that that amount of money has been funded, and it is state-directed. In Washington State, for example, the governor appointed a board to basically take that money, and they have then contracted with local counties and other local entities to come up with conservation, restoration, recovery projects. And so far from their website, I counted about 500 different projects have been funded. And I think this could serve as a model where you could broaden this to biodiversity. Fund them in the key hotspot states where we need more biodiversity. This board, once it's appointed by the governor, could spend some time saying, like Hillary pointed out in her presentation, let's figure out what we need. What are our objectives? Where is the land that's going to work with those reserves? And then establish the objectives, have some effectiveness metrics, and then go out to these local groups and say, this is what we want. You guys come back to us and come back with proposals. Prioritize them. Make sure that they're effective, and then let them compete for that grant money. And let these boards be the funnel, bring together all the different grant monies, if you will. And I think it's a model that if we let it work, you could go out and acquire not just fee land, not just conservation easements, but I think they could get conservation plans as well. And I'll use an example. Right now in Washington State, there is a landowner next to us who owns owl habitat, and they bought it from Boise Cascade Corporation, who couldn't deal with the owl situation there, didn't want to. And what they've been doing on this land to get it ready for harvest is to decertify owl circles. That is, over a 3-year surveying period, they've shown that the owls have disappeared. And now, under the state regulations and under Section 9, they can harvest that habitat. It's a lousy way to conserve owls. And now they've been challenged, although I think, I don't know all the actual facts. There's an environmental group in Washington that's saying that constitutes a Section 9 take. But what they really want is for them to do a landscape management plan. But they have no incentive to do so. Absolutely none. But under this kind of an approach, that environmental group, Bill Snape, or any of the environmental groups here would have an incentive to work with that landowner, say, here's how we could come up with a least cost solution, and we will compensate you for your costs and give you a return on your investment. Because I'll go back to my axiom, if it doesn't make economic sense, it's not going to happen. So that's what I had to say. Thank you.
If it doesn't make economic sense, it's not going to happen. That's a great note to end on. Very sympathetic. So the final speaker is Tim Duane. Tim is a professor at UC Berkeley. It's actually a little bit difficult to tell what he's a professor of, because he holds appointments in 3 separate departments. He's a sort of contemporary equivalent of Renaissance man. But I guess his principal home is in town and country planning, with at least a secondary home in Energy and Resources Group. Professionally, Tim's worked on the Sierra Nevada Ecosystem Project Science team. He's worked on the California Spotted Owl Federal Advisory Committee, and he's the author of Shaping the Sierra, Nature, Culture, and Conflict in the Changing West. Tim.
Well, I want to first of all thank the organizers, in particular Frank Davis, for letting me invite myself to the conference, and then his colleagues who let me walk into the bullpen, and eventually for calling me in here in the last innings. I guess I'm kind of, the closer for the morning session, and with advance apologies, I have to leave right after the session to catch a train in order to try to reduce my ecological footprint. But I think that all the speakers this morning have raised really important points, and I think that it's a chance to try to tie together a couple of ideas from previous sessions. I'll try to do so in the next 14 minutes and 40 seconds. There are two interlocking sets of themes I want to explore here. One is a set of ecological themes, and they have to do with how much we actually do or don't understand about the ecological relationships that exist on working landscapes, or to use a different term to avoid the pejorative rhetoric that Mark flagged, urban and agricultural landscapes, which is the term used by the paper that Brosey, Daly, and Davis have. And then secondly, I want to talk more importantly, perhaps, about the social and cultural dimensions of dealing with these urban and agricultural landscapes, because I think they're very different than many of the social and cultural and institutional aspects that we've dealt with in the so-called reserve strategy to date. I have three premises in approaching this working landscapes, and I'm going to use the term just for convenience because it is one that we have used. And I agree with Mark, though, that all landscapes are working. They're just producing different kinds of goods and services. My first premise is one that was already raised by Hillary and others, that we simply don't have enough money to buy it all. That if a reserve strategy were an adequate strategy, we would not have sufficient funds. And therefore, we have to think about the context in which reserves operate. The Rosenzweig paper calling for a reconciliation ecology, I think, should be viewed not as an alternative to reserves, but a complement for. Not a substitute, but a complement. And I like Paul's comment this morning, reserves and beyond, rather than beyond reserves. Reserves are an essential part of this, but we will never have enough money to acquire enough in reserves. So we have to think about these contextual landscapes. A second premise I have is that we will never have enough regulatory authority or political will to regulate it all. Okay? And I'll return to this in a moment. That at the very least, the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, nor shall private property be taken for public use, is really critical. Those 12 words have profound importance, but I will highlight in my conversation here that they have more social and political importance, perhaps, than even their legal significance. And then finally, this is going to set Steve Schneider up for the afternoon, I think that there are, between climate change and other stochastic processes, take fires and hail within a few weeks in Southern California as examples, we have to think about a dynamic shifting landscape if we are thinking about long-term viability of habitat and providing ecological functionality. So this leads us to the conclusion, I think, that agricultural and urban landscapes or working landscapes really must be managed in ways that are consistent with biodiversity values. And there are different ways in which we might manage them, but that begs a number of questions about what it is we're trying to achieve and whether we know whether we've done so. I want to just mention briefly before I turn to the substance of this, though, Dan Tarleck's, Buzz did such a great job covering the papers this morning that I'm actually going to get to talk about the project I've been working on for the last year and a half, which is evaluating how the Packard Foundation spent $291 million on conservation in California. And associated with those projects, there was over $1 billion in federal, state, and other funds spent. But Dan Tarleck had a paper in there as well that wasn't mentioned this morning, where he talks about the ESA and its relationship to urban landscape management. And there's sort of two dimensions to it, I think. One is he talks about the local land use planning process. And this is an introduction to the case book he wrote with Robert Ellickson that I read in 1984 on land use controls. And I recommend it to you because understanding how local land use planning works is really fundamentally different than a lot of the federal land management mechanisms we're more familiar with. And in particular, if the Endangered Species Act is not there with the hammer, in Virginia's words, and it was nice to hear both Virginia and Jim say, if it weren't for Section 9, we probably wouldn't be here doing certain things. I think that's really important to understand. If that's not there, and if we're focusing upon prevention, avoiding endangerment by altering the ways in which we develop and manage these agricultural and urban landscapes, we have to understand the local planning process, and it's different because there's not that hammer compelling people to come into the room. And this leads to the second point, which is that Dan also talks a lot about the legal constitutional constraints because of the takings clause, and I think that there is a very, very large gap between what the legal limits of takings jurisprudence are and what the political limits of takings jurisprudence are on the ground in local decision making. To quote Yogi Berra, in theory there's no gap between theory and practice, but in practice the gap is rather large. Now, the key theme that links these ideas is something that Jeff began with, which is really pretty simple, that social and cultural values matter. Okay? And if you're talking about how to structure a process between a set of consultative federal agencies, there's one set of social and cultural values. If you're talking about getting the local city council or the local county supervisors to make a decision on either a Tuesday or Monday night or a Tuesday morning, you have to be able to count to 3 or 4, depending on whether you have 5 or 7 people on the board. And a majority of them, or a slight minority, will be up for re-election within 2 years, and the process you're engaged in will take more than 2 years. The Planning Commission has a very political, responsive view of the world, but also the Planning Director does. And when is the last time that the Secretary of Interior had to sit in front of all of the U.S. President's constituents screaming about how a given action would affect their land? Not very recently. Every planning director in the United States does so once a week, okay? That has a bearing upon whether or not they follow the takings jurisprudence of the Supreme Court or the takings pulse of the local letters to the editor. Much of my work has been in the Sierra Nevada, where I study this process over about a 35-year period, and there's some pretty important lessons from that I'll try to cover briefly today. But let me first talk about the ecological, and then I'll focus on more upon the social. On the ecological dimension, there's an incredible paucity of understanding about the ecological relationships at work here. We have classified, even in the paper that Frank and Gretchen and Barry wrote, we've classified things as urban, agricultural. We live in a binary world when it comes to agriculture and urban landscapes. Biologists see them all as blank spaces on the map, okay? And there's very little distinction within them. Yet we have a lot of heterogeneity in how we think about wildlife habitat and characterizing the landscape in other terms. About 10 years ago, I was at the Landscape Ecology Conference, and I was struck how there were between 5 and 10 different types of agricultural landscapes described among all the papers I saw. With hedgerows, with woodlots, riparian setbacks, 2 of the 3, all 3, none. Okay, we've got a bunch of possible ways of thinking about prairie landscapes in the Midwest. I only found one paper that distinguished urban landscapes and distinguish them into 2 categories of urban landscape based upon the habitat needs of the 2 species, the 2 bird species this person was looking at. We have to understand urban landscapes and, frankly, agricultural landscapes with much, much more sophistication before we can start to think about how to manage them to achieve certain kinds of results. And that's going to, frankly, require representation, classification, and understanding of processes at a much finer level of resolution than we have done so far. Our GIS databases, the CWHR system, the California Wildlife Habitat Relationship, has, I think it's a 40-acre minimum mapping unit, okay? Well, does the 40 acres have 40 1-acre lots on it? 1 house on 40 acres? 20? At what point is it urban? Do they have cats or not? Michael Soule's work in San Diego, the presence of the cats is critical. Fences or not? Do they water their land a lot? Because if they do, they probably have a lot of invasive species they've just introduced into the landscape. All of those things matter, and they matter at the level of individual behavior and microscopic from the standpoint of our landscape scale processes. Yet they may prove to be the most important things. If you have cowbirds or not, it's going to make a difference as to whether you have songbirds or not. And that may be driven by very, very finely grained sort of distinctions on the landscape. So we have a black and white perspective on urban and on agriculture. We need at least shades of gray, and I would suggest we need multiple colors in thinking about the complexity, and that's going to require us to come down in scale to understand finely textured distinctions in terms of what is human presence on the landscape. Now, with 6 minutes and 2 seconds left, I want to turn to another subject, which is really about this issue of the social dimension. And I want to also just say that, you know, this call for research is one that we've been hearing for 10 years, and I'm pleased to see, as we've discovered that reserves may not do it all, that there is more attention on research about these urban intermixed kinds of landscapes. Holly said yesterday that we were, you know, the ESA is a gawky adolescent. I would suggest that if the ESA is a gawky adolescent, then our understanding of urban and agricultural ecological relationships is merely a toddler. and we need to make some serious investments to get it out of daycare and get it ready for graduate school. And it has to happen in a lot faster time frame than the normal process. I have a 3-year-old. I can't wait 15 years for an understanding of these ecological relationships. I can wait 15 years for him to get to college, but we need to move a lot faster if we're going to be able to make interventions in the landscape. So let's turn to the social dimension. I mentioned that the Packard Foundation hired me to do an external evaluation of their Conserving California Landscapes initiative. The Packard Foundation committed to spend a lot of money in the Central Coast, the Central Valley, and the Sierra Nevada of California, and in doing so, try to deploy a wide range of strategies to achieve conservation. One of their metrics was a certain number of acres conserved. And we can spend a lot of time discussing what does conserved mean. 185,000 of those acres acquired out of about 325,000 acres acquired in the first 5 years were conservation easements on so-called working landscapes. And we did a series of case studies looking at them in detail, and we found first of all, a number of ecological questions were raised. Does it matter whether the conservation easement does or does not allow you to turn it into a vineyard? Okay, if the primary purpose was blue oak woodland and the ecological values it provides, there was a big debate on a conservation easement as to whether they could constrain a certain fraction of that conservation easement from being turned into a vineyard or not, because that would actually undermine many of the ecological purposes of the easement. There were big differences between the Department of Conservation, which is concerned with farmland conversion, and the Wildlife Conservation Board. There were big differences between the different grantees, the California Rangeland Trust, the Sierra Business Council, the Great Valley Center, the Monterey Historical and Agricultural Land Conservancy. These groups all had different criteria because they had different social values that they existed for in pursuing conservation easements. So we have to get clearer and more transparent about what it is we're trying to achieve. And frankly, that's difficult to then translate into action if you don't know how a given intervention or conservation easement constraint affects whether you achieve that. So there's a real need for definition of goals because they vary so widely. In addition, the last points that were made by Jim, and I think all three of the panelists here, it's my second point here, is that landowners' economic requirements are critical. That you can't just do the ecological analysis, even if we understood it. Will this conservation achieve viability for the species? You need to do an economic analysis. Will this landowner still be around in 30 years? And equally importantly, if there's a breach of the conservation easement, who has a right to litigate? Who has a right? The holder of the easement and the original party that might own the land, or the subsequent owner who might violate it. Third parties may not have any standing to enforce the terms of the easement. This is a really big issue in terms of whether we will achieve for public purposes the goals with public money in many cases that we're trying to achieve through these easements. But you have to address the ecological or the economic dimensions and concerns. And then I'd say that there's a real tension there that goes beyond just economics to social and cultural values. And I would say if it's not economic, it's not sustainable, but also if it's not socially and culturally sensitive, it's not economic or sustainable. When I do my work in the Sierra Nevada, I never wear my UC Berkeley hat. Instead, I was the varsity football captain of the Nevada Union Miners in 1977, okay? And my grandfather was a timber feller for the Forest Service, and I was a fire dispatcher for the Forest Service, okay? And I have a certain set of rootedness there, and I don't wear these clothes, I wear jeans, because otherwise if I walk in wearing my pointy-headed academic hat, I'm gonna be ignored. There is an absolute imperative that we think about the social processes in which we operate for working landscapes that's very different. And I say this is the biggest finding in terms of our work looking at conservation transactions. What could be simpler than offering people money to let them manage their lands in a more sustainable way? It took a lot longer, much longer to do conservation easements. And these did not involve regulatory regimes. You can't blame it on the scientists, you can't blame it on the ESA, you can't blame it on bureaucracies. These are, I'm a foundation, I have billions of dollars and I want to give you a few $100 million of it, okay? But it still took a lot longer to get ranchers to agree to that than to get people in urban areas to agree to it. Now why? They did so for two primary reasons, I think. One is that there was a cultural resistance to any restriction upon landowner rights. Even after getting money, compensation for restrictions on rights, there are still complaints that your rights are restricted. I mean, the money's in the bank, but God damn it, I don't have control of my land anymore, and I still should have control of my land. And no, you can't come on my land and monitor whether I'm doing what I agreed to do, because that violates my personal sovereignty, okay? So there has to be a sensitivity to understanding that these aspects are going to change the time frame for getting projects, and equally importantly, we need to think about the social processes that will achieve protection. The social processes might require you to do this detour. Jeff's is slower than mine, luckily, so he has one more minute for me. The social processes might require you to do a deal with the ranch that is not the highest priority ecologically, but has the leader in the community. Because once you do that deal, everyone else gets off their split rail fence and comes to town. Okay? I am serious. One of the major deals done in the Sierra Valley, the 13,000-acre Bar 1 Ranch, the first deal done under the Packard program, is clearly not the highest priority biologically. But after 5 years of having meetings in kitchens with people to get them on the idea of conservation easements and estate planning and the values of keeping working landscapes going, that was the deal that had to be done. Why? Because the manager of that ranch is the president-elect of the California Cattlemen's Association. He's also a board member of the California Rangeland Trust, and his credibility can be carried to the bank for the next 10 years with other ranchers in that valley. And so the little places that are hotspots, that are high priorities, will now get protected probably because of that intermediate outcome of getting him on board, okay? So there's some things you need to do that, I'm all in favor of prioritization processes, but some of the prioritization criteria might be less transparent and less ecological if your ultimate goal is to achieve ecological outcomes. So finally, since my time is up, I want to add, though, that even these kinds of working landscapes conservation easement strategies will also not be sufficient in and of themselves. You need to deploy complementary strategies, and I don't have time to talk about them, but I'll encourage a question about it. We also looked a lot at some land use regulation cases, and you clearly need some combination of reserves by acquisition, public ownership, fee title control, conservation easements, working economic landscapes, social acceptance, still on the tax rolls kinds of things, and also there's a role for regulation. There's also a role for landowner information, for the extension outreach kinds of things we talk about, and it's not any one strategy that's going to be the silver bullet if we want to have viable, ecologically functioning, and socially acceptable regimes. We need to deploy all those strategies in a portfolio that in the end presents an opportunity not to just have conflicts between these different goals, but some convergence in our achievement of them. Thank you.
It's not a question about reserve, so I don't want to interrupt that discusussion if yours is about reserve.
Yeah, maybe just very quickly, because I keep puzzling with this, and I want to give an example, and maybe it's useful. And it involves Florida, and it involves your part of Florida. The state of Florida did a wonderful habitat plan. It's called Closing the Gaps in Florida's Wildlife Habitat Conservation System. Some of the areas identified as critical to the state's habitat system are large cattle ranches north of the Everglades, and they're in there because they're good panther habitat, they're good black bear habitat. Those areas do not have to come out of private ownership. They don't have to stop being cattle ranches. In fact, they probably don't have to change anything they're doing. But if they become citrus orchards or condos,
Or sod.
or sod, then the state's habitat system is not going to be complete. Now, I think the question is how to keep them in uses that are compatible with the elements of biodiversity they're currently maintaining. And you could look at them as reserves against citrus orchards and condos, or you can look at them as working lands because they're still cattle ranches and can still be cattle ranches. And I just hope that we can begin to evolve our understanding of what we're talking about in these large-scale patterns of lands to manage for biodiversity. Understanding management can be anything from continuing what you do to being wilderness to restoring it to what it was. I mean, it's context and element specific, and I hope we can sort of get beyond the reserve, non-reserve debate.
I think, just to add my own 2 cents worth, I think in cases like that, society has to be willing to pay people to retain a land value, a land use, which is not necessarily the highest value land use. So if those landowners could in principle make more using their land than something else, but if we prefer them to support biodiversity by current practices, we need the kind of thing that I guess Jim was referring to briefly with bond issues, tax-exempt bond issues, where we can provide cash incentives to people to do that. Anyway, sorry, next question.
I wanted to say something more to what Mr. Christensen had said. I'm getting a little discouraged by the talks this morning because of what appears to be a disconnect between in the understanding of what's actually going on in the states. And we've heard about Florida's biodiversity program. We've heard about actions in Wisconsin and California, and these are not entirely unusual. Most states have very robust biodiversity programs. Ours has 20 biologists working on $2 million a year. It's alarming in the sense that there's a couple problems in that this is under the radar of the group represented here, in that, first of all, it doesn't encourage good work in the states to not recognize those states that are doing a good job. And the second is that most of those states, biodiversity programs are within fishing and hunting organizations. And so not only are they trying to protect biodiversity, but they're working in an environment that is oftentimes dominated by fishing and hunting cultures or constituencies. And so it's a battle within the program. So support is really important. Support for state ESA statutes, regulations, and for biodiversity programs is a very big opportunity to improve the Federal Endangered Species Act protection. Now, my second statement is a question. We've heard several references to landscape level protection, and it was mentioned in Buzz's talk that there were landscape efforts where the farmers or the ranchers gradually lost interest and didn't become and were no longer part of it. And that landscape efforts are, some are very successful, a lot are not. And my question is relates to the federal government's role. The federal government can easily relate to a single landowner, a forestry company or a rancher, but in most states there's a very integral legal relationship between the state and the county or the state and the municipality that can't be breached. So if the federal government comes in and tries to organize a landscape level action that includes multiple landowners and municipalities, it's not true. They may make a relationship, but then when it comes to reality, you still have to deal with the state regulations on water quality, on biodiversity, or whatever it is. And so that disconnect, I think, may be a problem in landscape level protections. And so that's my question. Is that true in everyone's experience?
Well, it seems that Secretary Babbitt's comments yesterday are appropriate here in terms of the background structure of the state's land use planning regime and biodiversity protection strategies will either make it easy or hard to do that. In California, as my question to the Assistant Secretary last night suggested, we have a structure in place, but it only seems to be deployed when there are endangered species involved. So there's clearly something that's causing it not to be deployed preventatively, and I think it's basically money and motivation. The money and technical assistance side of it are starting points, and maybe the feds could come in and provide some information. Maybe the feds can fund some research on specific questions that then will allow communities to use existing state laws, in the California kind of case, to do an NCCP, for example, preventatively, rather than only after there's very little flexibility in the landscape because a bunch of species have been listed. Now, for other states, I think that there is much more of a constraint. But there's nothing preventing the federal government from coming and helping California communities who are interested in it in trying to address species planning issues.
I would answer that question a couple ways. It depends, I think, on what the use of the land is. If it's development, then that is typically regulated at the local level or county or city. But if it's forestry, it's normally, in my experience, it's at the state level. And so we don't, for example, get regulated. When we did our HCPs, for example, we don't get regulated by cities or counties. It's at the state level. And in Washington State, for example, because of the way it's structured, they will defer to an HCP. And so they basically say, okay, you guys figure it out with the feds and we're not going to be involved. So I think there's some validity in your point that conflicting state or local or county regulations can be a huge disincentive to trying to get a federal permit where you're having to cover multiple regulatory playing fields, if you will. It can be very difficult to try to negotiate in one plan 3 or 4 different regulatory agendas. Take, for example, Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act. We tried to have our fish HCP meet the requirements of a TMDL under the Clean Water Act, but EPA wasn't willing to go there. They weren't willing to say, okay, if you guys work it out in biological terms that are good for clean water, all the things you have to do for fish, you guys can do that for fish and wildlife purposes, but we're not going to say that that's clean water for purposes of the Clean Water Act. I think the same conflict could exist. It may be okay for species, but for purposes of our local zoning, that's not going to work. So if you want to get both at the same time, it's just going to add more cooks in the kitchen and make it tougher to do. So it's a real problem. But at least for forestry, the local and states have backed out. And in part, that's because states have been held liable for take in their regulatory system. So they're a little leery about doing anything in the regulatory system that isn't blessed by the feds in any event when it comes to endangered species. And so, probably rightly so, they basically deferred to the federal agencies.
There's another question from a gentleman at the back there, please.
Yeah, Bruce Stein with NatureServe. One of the things that I haven't heard come up at all during this discussion has to do with market-driven incentives related to working landscape. I mean, there's increased interest in the development of certification processes. The forest products industry in particular is one that we've worked with, where they've actually looked at incorporating biodiversity standards within their certification and have gone beyond just the federally listed species to those species and natural communities that we regard as imperiled or critically imperiled. And so I, asked the panel sort of how you see these sort of market-driven certification process or market-driven incentives more generally, not just forest products, but clearly there's some experiments in the ranching industry as well and other agricultural sectors.
Maybe I'll have a go at that first. It's actually very difficult in the ranching industry to push those things because you've got so many individual producers, and then you're dealing with a much narrower subsection of feedlots, and then you're going into a really narrow 3 major meat packing companies. So it's been really hard. We looked quite hard at producing natural beef on our ranch, and the industry barriers in front of us were almost insurmountable. We're working at the minute with the World Wildlife Fund, who have a program in our area where they're trying to push the idea of more Everglades-friendly beef, not for a sort of green natural beef market, but really to push the idea that the ranchers participating in this would be participating in improved water quality projects. But it's just incredibly tough as a rancher. We have one slaughterhouse in Florida that could cope with individual, ranchers' demands, and you have to get involved in the whole marketing effort. So it is very difficult as a rancher to try and do that. There are a few out west. I mean, Maverick Beef is one example. But many of them are small producers where they're just producing, they're only dealing with 20 or 50 head and they're producing organic beef and, on sort of natural areas. One thing that might change this in the industry is the new requirements for individual animal ID, which are coming down the pipeline. I mean, we're reckoning within 2 years we're going to have to, have all of our cattle ID'd. Of course, this is causing a huge concern in the industry because of the sheer logistics of running it. But that does provide down the road the ranchers with some opportunity to market their products. Sort of in our case, it would be Indian prairie beef. We've already thought about this. But there's no current certification program that would really push for that in the same way that you've got certification programs for forest products. So I would say early inklings of it, some regulatory mechanisms that might actually end up helping us do this down the road, but you're on your own as a rancher on this, and it's very, very difficult because, maybe Jeff will correct me, but the sort of the processing end of the industry does not make this easy for the individual rancher to tackle this on their own, unless you're a small producer. At our size, 3,000, we're producing 2,500 calves a year. It's just really difficult to do.
I guess I'd like to make add a little comment to that. It's actually an interesting question, Bruce, about how to get the industry to get involved with some of these incentives. On one hand, they're reluctant to give up what they view as their prerogatives for how things have happened, and they're by nature independent and conservative, and so you might expect that. But what gets to be the challenge is that apart from what we're doing as an association in representing the industry, there's a lot of people who are ranchers who are doing other things. And so the dynamic gets to be, I understand that you all are reluctant to pick up new ideas. On the other hand, as an association, don't we have a responsibility to not be cut short and sort of take into account some of these emerging trends? And as you're saying, it is a struggle, but it's something that is being articulated, and trying to get them to move forward to anticipate where society overall is moving.
I'd add a comment as to whether or not it truly is a market incentive. People always like certified products or conservation in general, as long as someone else pays for it. And our experience in the market is that there is no value given by the consumer for a certified product, whether it's an FSC product or an SFI, which is the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or the Forest Stewardship Council certification. That being said, however, many companies do get certified, and the question is why. And I think there's probably a social contract, if not an economic incentive, that managing your lands in a sustainable way makes sense politically. And so that's why you do it. But to get certified, it's very expensive. It costs money. And you can't justify it in terms of economic terms because you don't get a return on that investment.